The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at RAF Breise Norton as Staff Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his ceremonial uniform one final time. The red tunic, pristine and pressed to perfection, bore the weight of centuries of tradition. Today, however, it would carry something far heavier than heritage. Today, it would carry the grief of a nation and the love of a friend. James had known Private Thomas Tommy Williams since their first day at basic training 15 years ago. They were both 18 then, fresh-faced boys from different worlds who found brotherhood in the mud and sweat of military life. Tommy came from a small mining town in Wales, where his father had worked the same coal seam for 30 years before the pit closed. James grew up in the shadow of Windsor Castle, where his own father served as a Coldstream guard before him. The friendship between them seemed unlikely to outsiders. Tommy was loud and boisterous, always ready with a joke or a story about his adventures back home. He could make anyone laugh, even during the most grueling exercises. James was quieter, more reserved, carrying himself with the natural dignity that would eventually earn him a place among the Queen's Guard. But beneath their different exteriors lay the same fierce loyalty and unwavering courage that would define their military careers. They served together through 3 deployments in Afghanistan. In the dusty compounds of Helmand Province, their bond deepened beyond friendship into something closer to family. Tommy saved James's life during an ambush in Sanjin, dragging him to safety despite taking shrapnel in his own shoulder. James returned to favor 6 months later when their convoy hit an IED outside Lashkar-Gah. They learned to read each other's thoughts, to move as one unit in the chaos of combat. When James was selected for the ceremonial duties with the Household Division, Tommy couldn't have been prouder. He attended the passing-out parade in full dress uniform, beaming as his friend marched past in the famous red tunic and bearskin cap. "Look at you, proper tough now," Tommy had joked afterward over pints at their local pub. "Don't forget us common folk when you're guarding the Queen." But Tommy chose a different path. He transferred to the Parachute Regiment, drawn by the challenge and the tight-knit brotherhood of the airborne forces. His last deployment took him to Syria, where British forces were training local fighters against ISIS. It was supposed to be a safer assignment, mostly advisory work behind the lines. Tommy had called James just 2 weeks before the incident, laughing about how boring it was compared to their Afghanistan days. The call came at 3 in the morning. James was on duty at Wellington Barracks when his commanding officer found him during the changing of the guard. The official language was clinical, killed in action during enemy contact. But James knew the reality behind those words. Tommy had been leading a training exercise when a suicide bomber struck the compound. He died instantly, along with 2 other British soldiers and 6 Syrian trainees. The bureaucratic machine of military repatriation swung into action with practiced efficiency. Forms were filled, next of kin notified, arrangements made. Tommy's body would be flown back to Britain aboard a Royal Air Force transport plane, then driven in a cortege through the town of Wootton Bassett, where hundreds of ordinary citizens lined the streets to pay their respects to every fallen soldier who came home. But James couldn't bear the thought of his friend making that final journey alone. He requested special leave to serve as honor guard for the repatriation ceremony. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, understood immediately. He had served with both men in Afghanistan and knew the depth of their friendship. The paperwork was expedited through channels that usually moved with glacial slowness. Standing on the tarmac now, James felt the weight of his responsibility settling around him like armor. The ceremonial sword at his side had been polished to mirror brightness. His boots gleamed despite the early morning dew. Every brass button on his tunic caught the light. Tommy would have made some joke about him looking like a Christmas decoration, but the humor felt hollow now. The RAF transport plane appeared as a distant speck against the pale sky, growing larger as it approached the runway. James straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin, falling into the posture that had become second nature during his years of ceremonial duty. Around him, other military personnel took their positions. The base chaplain clutched his prayer book, the medical team waited with their stretcher, and a small honor guard of Royal Marines stood at attention. The plane touched down with barely a whisper, its pilots executing the landing with the reverence due to their precious cargo. As it taxied toward them, James felt his throat tighten. Somewhere in the hold of that aircraft lay the physical remains of his closest friend, sealed in a flag-draped coffin that would become the focus of a nation's gratitude. The engines wound down to silence. Ground crew approached with careful, measured steps, their usual efficiency tempered by solemnity. The rear cargo door began to lower, revealing the interior of the hold. James caught his first glimpse of the Union Jack draped over the coffin, and something deep inside him cracked. But he didn't break. Not here, not now. Tommy deserved better than that. He deserved a friend who could stand tall and strong, who could see him home with all the dignity and honor that his sacrifice had earned. James blinked away the moisture that threatened his eyes and focused on the task ahead. The chaplain stepped forward as the coffin was carefully transferred to the waiting hearse. His words of blessing were carried away by the morning breeze, but James felt their weight nonetheless. This was more than military protocol. It was a sacred duty, a final act of service for someone who had given everything. As the small procession formed behind the hearse, James took his position directly behind the vehicle. His measured pace, perfected through countless hours of drill, would carry Tommy home to his family in Wales. The journey would take them first to a commercial airport, where Tommy's coffin would be transferred to a civilian flight for the final leg home. The drive through the countryside passed in contemplative silence. James watched the familiar English landscape roll past the windows of the follow car. Fields of green dotted with sheep, stone walls that had stood for centuries, villages where ordinary people went about their ordinary lives, unaware that a hero was passing through their midst. This was what Tommy had fought for, what he had died protecting, the quiet, enduring peace of home. At Heathrow Airport, the mood shifted. The military precision of the RAF base gave way to the controlled chaos of commercial aviation. Passengers hurried past with their rolling suitcases, focused on their own destinations and dramas. Flight attendants rushed between gates, their cheerful professionalism masking the exhaustion of long shifts. The PA system crackled with announcements in multiple languages. James felt out of place in the civilian world, his red tunic and ceremonial bearing drawing curious stares from passers-by. Some recognized the significance immediately. A few older men nodded with understanding, perhaps veterans themselves. Others simply saw an oddly dressed soldier and wondered what event he might be attending. The airline staff had been briefed about the special cargo they would be carrying. The ground crew approached the hearse with appropriate solemnity, understanding that this was no ordinary freight transfer. But as the coffin was being moved toward the aircraft, a problem emerged. The duty manager, a harried-looking woman in her 40s, approached James with a clipboard and an apologetic expression. Her name tag read Sarah Mitchell, and she wore the kind of forced smile that customer service professionals perfect over years of dealing with difficult situations. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trying to defuse a potential confrontation. "We weren't told that military personnel would be accompanying the cargo." James felt something cold settle in his stomach. "I'm the honor guard," he said simply. "Private Williams doesn't travel alone." Sarah consulted her clipboard, flipping through several pages of documentation. "I understand, sir, and I respect what you're doing. But our manifest doesn't show any military passenger bookings. The cargo hold is sealed once we're airborne. There's no provision for guard duties during flight." "Then I'll travel in the passenger cabin," James replied, his voice steady despite the growing tension in his chest. "I have my ticket." This was true. His commanding officer had arranged for him to fly on the same aircraft, maintaining his vigil over Tommy's remains even if he couldn't physically be present in the cargo hold. The symbolism mattered. The unbroken chain of honor mattered. Sarah's expression grew more strained. "Sir, I'm afraid there's another issue. Your uniform, it's quite distinctive. Some passengers might find it unsettling. They might ask questions we're not prepared to answer." James stared at her for a long moment, struggling to process what he was hearing. "Unsettling?" he repeated. "The red tunic, the sword, it's very military. Some people might be concerned about security, especially if they don't understand the context. And if they learn there's a coffin in the cargo hold, well, some passengers are superstitious about flying with." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but James understood. She was worried about passenger comfort, about complaints, about the airline's reputation for pleasant, worry-free travel. Tommy's sacrifice, his final journey home, was being reduced to a potential public relations problem. Private Williams died serving his country. James said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people step back. He's going home to his family. I'm going with him. Sarah looked genuinely sorry, but she stood her ground. I understand, sir, and I'm not saying you can't fly, but perhaps you could change into civilian clothes? We have facilities here where you could. No. The word came out harder than James intended, drawing attention from nearby passengers. A small crowd was beginning to form, people slowing their rush pace to see what was happening. Some held up phones, ready to capture whatever drama was unfolding. Sir, please, Sarah said, lowering her voice. I'm trying to find a solution here. The captain has final authority over who boards his aircraft, and if he thinks your presence might cause a disturbance. James felt the anger building in his chest, a red heat that threatened to overwhelm his military discipline. This woman, this airline, this system of bureaucracy and customer service was trying to separate him from Tommy. They wanted to treat his friend like cargo, to hide the reality of military sacrifice behind a veneer of commercial normalcy. But he was a Queen's Guard. He had stood motionless for hours in the rain outside Buckingham Palace while tourists took pictures and children tried to make him smile. He had endured the jeers of protesters and the heat of summer in full ceremonial dress without breaking formation. He would not break now. Private Williams was awarded the Military Cross for gallantry, James said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. He saved 6 lives in Afghanistan before giving his own in Syria. He's 28 years old, and his mother is waiting for him at Cardiff Airport. I gave her my word that her son would not travel alone. The crowd had grown larger now, and James could see the mixture of expressions on their faces. Some looked sympathetic, others uncomfortable. A few teenagers held up phones, recording the confrontation for social media. But in the back, he spotted an older man in a Veterans Association pin, nodding with understanding. Sarah's radio crackled with urgent chatter. The delay was backing up the carefully orchestrated schedule of aircraft movements. Ground crew stood waiting, unsure whether to proceed with loading the coffin. The pilot appeared at the top of the aircraft steps, looking down at the scene with growing concern. Sir, Sarah tried again, if you could just work with me here. But James wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about Tommy's mother, Mrs. Williams, who had welcomed him into her home countless times over the years. She treated him like a second son, always keeping his favorite tea in the cupboard and his preferred biscuits in the tin. When Tommy deployed to Syria, she made James promise to look after her boy, even though they were serving in different units on different continents. How could he explain to her that bureaucracy had forced him to abandon his post? How could he face her knowing that he had let airline policy override military honor? How could he break a promise to a mother whose son had already paid the ultimate price? The standoff continued, with neither side willing to give ground. Behind them, Tommy waited in the cargo hold, wrapped in the flag he had served so faithfully. And, around them, the ordinary world of commercial travel continued its relentless pace, indifferent to the extraordinary sacrifice it was being asked to accommodate. James straightened his shoulders and prepared for the fight of his life. Not with bullets or bombs, but with words and will and the unshakable conviction that some things were more important than passenger comfort. Tommy was going home, and James was going with him. Everything else was just noise. The situation at Heathrow Terminal 2 had reached a critical point. James Morrison stood his ground in full ceremonial dress, his red tunic a stark contrast against the sterile whites and grays of the airport terminal. Around him, a crowd of passengers had gathered, their phones raised to capture what was quickly becoming a viral moment. The duty manager, Sarah Mitchell, clutched her clipboard like a shield while airport security began moving closer to assess the potential disturbance. James could feel the weight of countless eyes upon him, but his focus remained laser-sharp on the task at hand. Tommy's coffin sat in the cargo bay just 50 meters away, and bureaucratic red tape was threatening to break the sacred chain of honor that connected them. Every instinct in his military-trained mind screamed against backing down, but he also understood the delicate nature of his position. One wrong move could escalate this into an international incident. Ma'am, James said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of the parade ground while maintaining respectful courtesy. I need you to understand something. This isn't about airline policy or passenger comfort. This is about honoring a promise made to a grieving mother and ensuring that a war hero receives the respect he earned with his life. Sarah Mitchell's expression softened slightly, but The pressure from her superiors was evident in the way she kept glancing at her radio. Sir, I truly sympathize with your situation, but we have protocols for a reason. The captain has the final say on who boards his aircraft, and right now he's concerned about the disruption this could cause. From behind the growing crowd, a voice called out with a distinctly Welsh accent. What seems to be the problem here, then? The crowd parted to reveal a middle-aged man in maintenance overalls, his British Airways ID badge swinging as he approached. His name tag read David Hughes, and James could see the recognition in the man's eyes as he took in the ceremonial uniform. "You're a Queen's Guard," David said with certainty. Not a question, but a statement of fact. "My boy served with the Welsh Guards before he moved to Civvy Street. I know that uniform, and I know what it means when someone like you is at an airport." James nodded once, grateful for the understanding. Private Thomas Williams, Royal Welsh Fusiliers. He's going home to Cardiff. David's expression grew solemn as the full picture became clear. He turned to Sarah Mitchell with the kind of authority that comes from decades of airport experience. "Sarah, love, we need to sort this properly. This soldier isn't just any passenger. He's doing his duty, same as we do ours." "David, I appreciate your input, but the manifest clearly states the manifest can be amended," David interrupted gently, but firmly. "I've seen it done for medical emergencies, for diplomatic situations, for all sorts of reasons. This young man is escorting a fallen hero home. If we can't make accommodations for that, then what kind of people are we?" The crowd around them had grown to nearly 50 people, and James could see the mix of nationalities and backgrounds represented. There were business people in expensive suits checking their watches impatiently, families with children pressing forward to see what was happening, elderly couples leaning on each other for support, and young backpackers with their massive rucksacks. Among them, James spotted a woman in her 70s wearing a small poppy pin on her lapel, despite it being months past Remembrance Day. She met his eyes and gave him an encouraging nod. Next to her stood a young man in military fatigues, American by the look of his uniform, who was recording everything on his phone, but with a serious expression rather than the entertainment-seeking look of the other smartphone users. "My grandson deployed to Iraq last year," the elderly woman called out, her voice cutting through the general murmur of conversation. "If something happened to him, I'd want someone like you making sure he got home safe." This seemed to break something loose in the crowd. Others began speaking up, sharing their own connections to military service, their own understanding of what James was trying to do. A businessman mentioned his brother-in-law who served in the Royal Navy. A young mother talked about her father who had served in Northern Ireland. The American soldier introduced himself as Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and offered his assistance in any way possible. Sarah Mitchell found herself facing not just one determined soldier, but a crowd of sympathetic passengers who clearly supported James's position. Her radio crackled again with increasingly urgent messages from the gate supervisor, the ground control coordinator, and what sounded like someone from the airline's regional management. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, raising her voice to address the crowd. "I understand your feelings about this situation, but we need to keep the boarding process moving. Flight BA 4792 to Cardiff is scheduled to depart in 45 minutes, and we have 200 passengers who need to reach their destination on time." "Then let the man do his job," called out David Hughes. "Stop making this more complicated than it needs to be." James appreciated the support, but he could also see the strain this was putting on Sarah Mitchell. She was clearly a decent person caught between competing demands, her duty to follow airline procedures and her human understanding of the situation. He decided to try a different approach. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, stepping closer and lowering his voice so only she could hear. "What if I could guarantee there would be no disruption? What if I gave you my word that I would board quietly, take my assigned seat, and remain there for the duration of the flight without causing any disturbance to other passengers?" Sarah looked at him uncertainly. "Sir, it's not just about your behavior during the flight. It's the questions, the attention. People are already filming this with their phones. If this goes viral on social media, let it," James replied simply. "Let people see that Britain still honors its fallen heroes. Let them see that when we make promises to grieving families, we keep them. Is that really the kind of publicity your airline wants to avoid?" Behind them, the American soldier, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, had been having a quiet conversation with several other passengers. Now he approached Sarah with his phone in hand. "Ma'am, I've been in contact with my commanding officer at RAF Lakenheath. He's confirmed this gentleman's credentials and the legitimacy of his mission. If it would help, he's offered to provide a formal letter of authorization that might satisfy your security concerns. This was unexpected, and James felt a surge of gratitude toward his fellow soldier. Military personnel, regardless of nationality, understood certain things instinctively. The American was extending the same courtesy and support that James would offer to any U.S. service member in a similar situation. Sarah's radio squawked again, this time with a different voice, older, more authoritative. "Sarah, this is Regional Manager Thompson. I'm watching the live stream of this incident on Twitter, and it's getting significant attention. Bring me up to speed immediately." The mention of social media seemed to galvanize everyone present. James could see passengers around them pulling out phones to search for the trending hashtags that were undoubtedly already forming. In the modern world, a story like this could explode across the internet in minutes, and airline companies were particularly sensitive to negative publicity. David Hughes, the maintenance worker, seemed to sense an opportunity. "Sarah, think about this from a business perspective. What looks worse? A short delay while you accommodate a war hero's honor guard, or videos of airport security dragging a Queen's Guard away from his fallen friend? Because that's where this is heading if you don't find a solution." James winced at the imagery, but recognized the tactical wisdom in David's words. Sometimes the threat of negative consequences was more persuasive than appeals to nobility or honor. It wasn't the way he preferred to operate, but if it got Tommy home with dignity, he would accept whatever worked. The crowd had continued to grow, and airport security was now taking a more active interest in the situation. Two officers in the distinctive uniforms of Heathrow's aviation police approached through the crowd, their body language alert but not aggressive. James could see them assessing the situation, noting the supportive crowd, the media attention, and the potential for escalation. "Good morning," the senior officer said, addressing both James and Sarah Mitchell. "I'm Inspector Williams, and before you ask, no relation to your Private Williams, though I do appreciate the coincidence. We've been monitoring this situation, and I'd like to help find a resolution that works for everyone." Inspector Williams had the kind of calm authority that comes from years of dealing with airport crises. James could see immediately that this man understood both the legal requirements of aviation security and the human elements that often transcended those requirements. "The way I see it," Inspector Williams continued, "we have several options here. We can continue this standoff until the flight is canceled due to delays, which helps nobody. We can escalate to the point where someone gets arrested, which definitely helps nobody. Or we can find a way to accommodate both security requirements and this gentleman's legitimate request to escort a fallen comrade home." Sarah Mitchell looked relieved to have someone else taking charge of the decision-making process. "Inspector, I've explained the manifest issues and the passenger comfort concerns, all of which are solvable problems," Inspector Williams replied. "Manifests can be amended with proper authorization. Passenger concerns can be addressed with appropriate communication. The question is whether we want to solve these problems or use them as excuses." James could feel the momentum of the situation shifting. The crowd around them had grown to over 100 people, creating a natural amphitheater in the busy terminal. Other flights were beginning to experience delays as passengers and staff gathered to watch the unfolding drama. The American soldier, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, was providing live commentary to his followers on social media, explaining the significance of military honors and the bonds between soldiers. "Inspector," James said, "I want to be clear about something. I'm not trying to cause problems for these people or this airline. I just need to fulfill my duty to my friend and his family. If there's a way to do that within your security requirements, I'm willing to work with any reasonable solution." The mention of family seemed to resonate with Inspector Williams, whose own demeanor suggested he might have military experience in his background. "What exactly did you promise the family, if you don't mind me asking?" "I promised his mother that her son wouldn't travel alone," James replied simply. "That there would be someone in uniform to ensure he received proper respect every step of his journey home." Inspector Williams nodded slowly, and James could see him weighing various factors: security protocols, public relations, human decency, and the broader implications of how Britain treated its military personnel. Around them, the crowd waited with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for sporting events or theatrical performances. "Ms. Mitchell," Inspector Williams said finally, I'm going to recommend that we proceed with boarding. The passenger manifest can be amended to reflect Sergeant Morrison's presence, and I'll provide a security clearance letter that should satisfy any remaining concerns." Sarah Mitchell looked uncertain, but was clearly relieved to have a decision taken out of her hands. "If you're authorizing it, Inspector, then I suppose—" "I am," he confirmed. "And furthermore, I think British Airways should consider this an opportunity to demonstrate their support for military families rather than an inconvenience to be managed." The crowd around them erupted in spontaneous applause, and James felt a mixture of relief and gratitude wash over him. Tommy's journey home could continue, and the promise made to a grieving mother could be kept. But as he prepared to board the aircraft, James knew that this was only the first challenge he would face. The flight to Cardiff was just the beginning of what would prove to be an even more complex and emotional journey. The Boeing 737 hummed quietly at 37,000 feet above the Welsh countryside, carrying its cargo of ordinary travelers and one extraordinary passenger making his final journey home. James Morrison sat in seat 14B, his ceremonial sword carefully stowed in the overhead compartment after a brief discussion with the cabin crew about proper protocols. His red tunic drew occasional glances from other passengers, but the atmosphere aboard the aircraft was one of respectful curiosity rather than the disruption that Sarah Mitchell had feared. The transformation in attitude had been remarkable. Once Inspector Williams had provided his authorization and the story began spreading through social media, the airline staff had shifted from obstruction to accommodation with impressive speed. The captain himself had emerged from the cockpit to shake James's hand and express his gratitude for Tommy's service. The senior flight attendant, a woman named Margaret who had worked for British Airways for 23 years, had quietly arranged for James to have an empty seat beside him and had personally ensured his comfort throughout the boarding process. As the aircraft climbed through the morning sky, James found himself in conversation with his fellow passengers. Word had spread through the cabin about why he was traveling, and rather than creating awkwardness, it seemed to generate a sense of shared purpose. The elderly woman with the poppy pin, whose name was Mrs. Eleanor Price, had moved from her original seat to sit across the aisle from him. Her grandson, she explained, was currently serving with the Royal Engineers in Estonia as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence. "It means something, you know," she said as the English countryside spread out below them like a patchwork quilt. "What you're doing for that young man's family. My husband served in Burma during the war, and when he passed away 15 years ago, it was the Regimental Association that made sure he had a proper send-off. Military people don't abandon their own." The American soldier, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, had also managed to change his seat assignment and was sitting behind James. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and understood the bonds forged in combat. "I lost my best friend in Kandahar," he said quietly. "IED, en route Vermont. I was supposed to be on that patrol, but I had food poisoning and couldn't go out. Marcus took my place on the vehicle." He paused, staring out the window. "His family asked me to speak at the funeral. Hardest thing I've ever had to do, but also the most important." These conversations helped pass the short flight to Cardiff, but James's mind kept drifting to what awaited him at the destination. Mrs. Williams would be there, along with Tommy's younger sister Sarah and his father Di, who had worked in the Rhonda mines for 40 years before they closed. James had met the whole family many times during his friendship with Tommy, sharing Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations, becoming part of their extended circle. Tommy had always been proud of his working-class Welsh roots, never letting his military service change his connection to home. He sent money back when times were tough, called his mother every Sunday, no matter where he was deployed, and always brought friends home for the big rugby matches. James remembered the first time Tommy had invited him to a Wales versus England game at the Millennium Stadium. The good-natured rivalry had lasted for years, with each man claiming superiority for his nation's team despite England's generally superior record. The family had been devastated by the news of Tommy's death, but they had found strength in each other and in the knowledge that their son had died serving something greater than himself. Mrs. Williams had called James personally after the official notification, her voice breaking as she thanked him for being such a good friend to her boy. "He talked about you all the time," she had said through her tears. "Said you were the brother he never had. Said if anything happened to him, you'd know what to do." That phone call had sealed James's determination to escort Tommy home personally. It wasn't just military protocol or ceremonial duty. It was family obligation, the kind that transcends blood relations and official requirements. Tommy would have done the same for him without question, and probably would have moved heaven and earth to do it with style and dignity. As the aircraft began its descent toward Cardiff Airport, James could see the Welsh landscape taking shape below them. The rolling green hills, the industrial valleys with their proud mining heritage, the coastal plains where generations of families had built lives around coal and steel and rugby. This was Tommy's homeland, the place that had shaped his character and given him the strength to serve his country with such distinction. Margaret, the senior flight attendant, appeared beside his seat as the passengers began preparing for landing. "Sergeant Morrison," she said quietly, "I wanted you to know that the captain has arranged for priority disembarkation. You'll be among the first off the aircraft, and the ground crew has been instructed to handle Private Williams's transfer with full military honors." James nodded his gratitude, touched by the care that everyone had shown once the initial bureaucratic hurdles had been overcome. "Thank you. That means more than you know. My brothers serve in the Falklands," she replied. "I understand what you're doing and why it matters." The landing was smooth, and as promised, James was among the first passengers to disembark. As he walked through the jet bridge and into Cardiff Airport's terminal, he could feel the weight of anticipation settling over him. Somewhere in this building, Tommy's family was waiting. They would have arrived hours early, as grieving families always do, sitting in uncomfortable chairs and watching every aircraft that landed, hoping and dreading the moment when their loved one finally came home. Cardiff Airport was smaller and more intimate than Heathrow, with a distinctly Welsh character that made James feel like he was entering Tommy's world rather than just another anonymous transportation hub. The signs were bilingual, the accents were musical, and there was a sense of community that reminded him why Tommy had always been so proud of his heritage. The baggage claim area was crowded with passengers from multiple flights, but James was directed to a separate area where special cargo transfers took place. Through the large windows, he could see the British Airways aircraft being positioned next to a white hearse that bore the crest of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. A small honor guard of local soldiers stood at attention beside the vehicle, their dress uniforms immaculate despite the Welsh drizzle that had begun to fall. James felt his throat tighten as he recognized the professionalism and respect being shown by these men he had never met. Military honor was universal, transcending individual units and personal relationships. These soldiers were preparing to receive one of their own with all the dignity that the occasion demanded. But before he could join the ceremony outside, he needed to find Tommy's family. They would be in the arrivals hall, watching and waiting for some sign that their long ordeal was nearing its end. James straightened his tunic, checked his appearance in a nearby mirror, and walked through the automatic doors into the main terminal. He spotted them immediately, clustered together in a corner near the information desk. Mrs. Williams sat rigidly upright in her black dress, her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes fixed on the doors through which arriving passengers emerged. Di Williams stood behind her chair, one weather hand resting protectively on his wife's shoulder, his face set in the kind of stoic expression that Welsh miners have perfected over generations of hardship. Sarah Williams, Tommy's 25-year-old sister, paced nervously nearby, unable to sit still despite her obvious exhaustion. She had flown back from her job in London the moment she received the news, and James could see the family resemblance in her restless energy and the way she carried herself with Tommy's characteristic blend of confidence and warmth. As James approached them across the terminal floor, Mrs. Williams looked up, and their eyes met. The recognition was instant and mutual. She had seen him in family photos and during video calls when Tommy was deployed. She stood slowly, her composure beginning to crack as the full reality of the situation hit her. Her son was here, in this building, but not in a way she had always imagined his homecoming. "James," she whispered, and then louder, "James." He crossed the remaining distance quickly and found himself enveloped in a fierce embrace that spoke of years of shared affection and current shared grief. Mrs. Williams was a small woman, but her hug carried the strength of maternal love and profound loss. She held him tightly, as if trying to hold onto some piece of her son through his closest friend. "You came," she said into his shoulder. "You brought him home. I gave you my word." James replied simply, "Tommy's not traveling alone." Di Williams approached with the measured dignity of a man who had faced hardship before, but never anything quite like this. He extended a calloused hand that told the story of a lifetime spent in manual labor, first in the mines and later in construction after the pits closed. His handshake was firm and meaningful, the grip of one working man acknowledging another's service. "The uniform suits you, son," Di said in his broad Welsh accent. "Tommy was proud to have a friend like you. Talked about you every time he called home." Sarah Williams had been hanging back, uncertain of her role in this military world that had claimed her brother's life. But now she stepped forward with Tommy's characteristic directness. "He said you saved his life in Afghanistan," she said. "Said if anything happened to him, you make sure he came home properly." James felt the weight of expectation and trust in her words. This family had placed their faith in him to navigate the complex process of military repatriation, to ensure that their son and brother received the honor he deserved. It was a responsibility that went far beyond official duty or personal friendship. "He's here," James said, looking at each of them in turn. "He's safe, and he's home. The ceremony outside will transfer him to your care, and then he can rest." Mrs. Williams wiped her eyes with a tissue that had already seen considerable use. "Will you stay?" she asked. "For the funeral? Tommy would want you there." "Of course," James replied without hesitation. "I've been granted leave for as long as needed." Through the terminal windows, they could see the ceremony beginning outside. The honor guard had formed up in precise formation, their movements sharp and purposeful despite the increasing rain. The hearse doors stood open, waiting to receive its precious cargo. Airport workers and passengers had gathered at respectful distances, drawn by the solemnity of the moment and the recognition that something important was taking place. James offered his arm to Mrs. Williams. "Shall we go and bring Tommy home?" Together, the four of them walked toward the exit, united by love, loss, and the knowledge that some bonds transcend death itself. Behind them, the ordinary business of the airport continued, but for these few people, time seemed suspended in a moment of profound significance. Tommy Williams was finally home, escorted by the friend who had promised never to leave him behind, and welcomed by the family who had shaped him into the man he became. The automatic doors slid open before them, and the Welsh air, soft with rain and heavy with emotion, greeted them as they stepped outside to witness the final act of a soldier's journey home. The transfer ceremony at Cardiff Airport unfolded with the kind of precision that transforms routine military protocol into something transcendent. James Morrison stood at attention beside the Williams family as Tommy's flag-draped coffin was carefully lifted from the aircraft's cargo, hauled by 8 pallbearers from the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. The Welsh rain had intensified, but not one of the assembled soldiers moved to seek shelter. Water dripped from the brims of their caps and ran down their immaculate uniforms, but their bearing remained absolutely rigid. Mrs. Williams clutched James's arm as she watched her son's coffin being transferred with such reverence. The reality of the moment hit her in waves. Pride at the honor being shown to Tommy, grief at the finality of his homecoming, and gratitude toward the men and women who were treating his remains with such dignity. Di Williams stood like a statue beside his wife, his weathered face set in stone but his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The commanding officer of the honor guard, a Major Jenkins whose own Welsh accent was as thick as valley fog, approached the family with measured steps. His salute to James was crisp and respectful, acknowledging not just his rank, but his role as Tommy's guardian on this final journey. "Mrs. Williams," he said, removing his cap as he addressed Tommy's mother, "on behalf of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers and Her Majesty's Armed Forces, please accept our deepest condolences. Your son served with distinction and died in the service of his country." The Major's words were formal, but James could hear the genuine emotion behind them. This wasn't just another ceremony for these soldiers. They were welcoming home one of their own, a brother-in-arms who had paid the ultimate price. The bonds of military service created a family that extended far beyond blood relations, and Tommy's death had touched every member of his regiment. As the coffin was placed in the hearse, a lone bugler from the Royal Welsh Fusiliers took position 20 meters away. The first notes of the last post rang out across the tarmac, hauntingly beautiful and achingly sad. The melody seemed to capture everything that couldn't be expressed in words, the loss, the sacrifice, the honor, and the love that bound soldiers together regardless of their differences. James felt his throat constrict as the familiar notes washed over him. He had heard this melody played at military funerals before, but never for someone so close to him. The music seemed to carry Tommy's spirit on the Welsh wind, bringing him home to the valleys and hills that had shaped his character and given him the strength to serve others. Sarah Williams broke down completely during the bugle call, her composure finally overwhelmed by the accumulated grief of the past week. She sobbed against her father's chest while Di wrapped his arms around her, his own tears finally beginning to fall. Mrs. Williams remained upright and dignified, but James could feel her trembling as she leaned against him for support. When the final note of the last post faded into silence, the honor guard performed one final salute before marching away in perfect formation. Their job was done. They had received their fallen comrade with full military honors and transferred him to the care of his family. Now the Williams family could begin the process of saying goodbye on their own terms. The drive from Cardiff Airport to the family home in the Rhondda Valley took them through landscapes that told the story of Wales in every hill and hollow. James sat in the front passenger seat of the funeral director's limousine, behind the hearse carrying Tommy, while the Williams family occupied the rear seats. The conversation was quiet and intermittent, punctuated by long silences as each person dealt with their own thoughts and emotions. They passed through Cardiff city centre, where ordinary people went about their daily business unaware that a hero was passing through their midst. A few individuals noticed the military hearse and the formal procession, offering respectful nods or raising their hands in brief salutes. At one traffic light, an elderly man in a Royal British Legion blazer stood at attention on the pavement until the convoy had passed. As they entered the valleys, the landscape became more intimate and personal. These were the hills where Tommy had grown up, the rugby pitches where he had learned teamwork and determination, the schools where he had dreamed of adventures beyond the confines of a small town. Every mile they traveled brought them deeper into Tommy's world, the place that had made him who he was. The Williams family home sat on a terrace street that climbed steeply up the valley side, identical houses marching up the hillside like soldiers in formation. Each home had its small front garden, its net curtains, and its satellite dish, but they also had something more intangible, a sense of community that had survived the closure of the mines and the economic hardships that followed. As the hearse pulled up outside number 47, James could see that the entire street had turned out to welcome Tommy home. Neighbors stood in their doorways or gathered in small groups on the pavement, their faces reflecting a mixture of sadness and pride. Many of the men wore their best suits despite the afternoon hour, while the women had put on their formal dresses as if attending church. Children who had been playing in the street had been called inside or gathered close to their parents, somehow understanding that this was a moment that required solemnity. Mrs. Davies from next door, who had known Tommy since he was born, approached Mrs. Williams with tears streaming down her face. "I saw him in his uniform at Christmas," she said. "So handsome he was, and so proud to be serving. We're all proud of him, love. All of us." The support of the community was overwhelming and immediate. Without being asked, the neighbors had organized themselves into an informal reception committee. Mrs. Jenkins from number 51 had prepared sandwiches and tea for the family and any visitors who might come to pay their respects. Mr. Thomas from the end of the terrace, a former coal miner like Di, had organized parking arrangements and was directing traffic with the authority of someone accustomed to managing dangerous and complex situations. James helped carry the family's luggage into the house, noting how Tommy's presence was still evident in every room despite his years of military service. His rugby trophies lined the mantelpiece, his school photographs hung on the walls, and his bedroom remained exactly as he had left it during his last visit home. Mrs. Williams had clearly preserved everything as a shrine to her son's memory, unable to change anything that connected her to happier times. The living room was small, but comfortable, dominated by a large television and a coal fireplace that spoke of practical Welsh sensibilities. Family photographs covered every available surface. Tommy as a baby, as a schoolboy, in his military uniform, with his friends and family at various celebrations. James appeared in several of the more recent pictures, evidence of how completely he had been welcomed into the family circle. As the afternoon wore on, visitors began arriving to pay their respects. Tommy's old rugby teammates came in their best clothes, their usual boisterousness muted by the circumstances, but their loyalty undiminished. His former teachers arrived with stories of a bright boy who had struggled with academics, but excelled at leadership and helping others. Childhood friends shared memories of adventures in the hills above the valley, of shared dreams and youthful ambitions. Each visitor brought a piece of Tommy's life with them, a memory or story that illuminated different aspects of his character. James found himself learning things about his friend that he had never known, seeing how Tommy's military service was built on foundations laid in this close-knit community. The values that had made him such an excellent soldier, loyalty, courage, selflessness, have been nurtured in these streets and in this house. Father McKenna from the local Catholic Church arrived in the early evening to discuss the funeral arrangements. He was a gentleman in his 60s who had baptized Tommy, confirmed him, and watched him grow into adulthood. His presence brought a sense of spiritual comfort to the family, a reminder that Tommy's death was not meaningless, but part of a larger pattern of sacrifice and service. Tommy was always special, Father McKenna told Mrs. Williams as they sat around the kitchen table planning the funeral service. Even as a young boy, he had a sense of responsibility toward others. When the older boys picked on the smaller ones, Tommy was always there to intervene. When Mrs. Patterson's roof leaked, he was up there with buckets and tarpaulin before anyone else even noticed the problem. The funeral would be held at St. David's Church, where Tommy had been baptized and where the Williams family had worshipped for 3 generations. The service would be followed by burial in the hillside cemetery overlooking the valley, where Tommy would rest among the miners and steelworkers and teachers who had built this community through generations of hard work and mutual support. As evening fell and the visitors gradually departed, James found himself alone with the Williams family for the first time since arriving in Wales. The formality of the day's ceremonies had given way to a more intimate kind of grieving, the quiet sharing of memories, and the slow acceptance of loss that could only happen among people who truly understood each other. Mrs. Williams made tea for everyone, her movements automatic after decades of caring for her family and community. She set out the good china that was usually reserved for special occasions, somehow understanding that this was both the most special and most terrible occasion she would ever face. The familiar ritual of preparing and serving tea provided a framework for conversation and comfort, a way of expressing love and care when words seemed inadequate. "He wrote to us about you," Mrs. Williams said as she poured James's cup. "Said you were the finest soldier he'd ever known. But more than that, you were a true friend. Said if he ever got married, you'd be his best man." James felt the weight of that unspoken future, all the experiences that Tommy would never have, and all the happiness that had been cut short by his death. The wedding that would never happen, the children he would never have, the grandchildren who would never know their grandfather's stories. The loss seemed infinite when viewed from this perspective, stretching out into a future that Tommy would never see. "He said the same about all of you," James replied. "Said his family was his strength, what kept him going during the difficult times. Said coming home to Wales was like recharging his batteries, getting back in touch with who he really was." Di Williams spoke for the first time in hours, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "He was a good boy," he said simply, "always trying to do right by people, always putting others first. Sometimes I worried he gave too much of himself away, but I suppose that's what made him special." Sarah Williams had been quiet for most of the day, still struggling to accept that her big brother was really gone. Now she looked at James with Tommy's direct gaze and asked the question that had been haunting all of them. Did he suffer at the end? James had been dreading this question, knowing it would come, but hoping he could find the right words when it did. He had read the classified reports about the incident in Syria, knew exactly how Tommy had died, and what his final moments had been like. But he also understood that sometimes the truth needed to be tempered with mercy. "It was instantaneous," he said, which was true. "He died doing what he believed in, protecting the people he was training. The Syrian soldiers he was with said he saved their lives by pushing them to safety before the explosion. He died a hero, and he didn't suffer." This seemed to bring some small comfort to the family, and they sat together in companionable silence as the Welsh rain continued to fall outside. Tomorrow there would be more visitors, more arrangements to make, more details to handle. But Tonight, they could simply sit together and remember Tommy Williams' son, brother, and friend who had given his life in service to others and who had finally come home to the valleys that had made him who he was. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 o'clock, its familiar sound marking the passage of time in a house where time now seemed both precious and meaningless. James knew that the next few days would test all of them in different ways, but he also knew that they would face those challenges together, united by their love for Tommy and their commitment to honoring his memory. The hardest part of the journey was still ahead, but at least they wouldn't have to travel alone. The morning of Tommy Williams's funeral dawned gray and misty in the Rhondda Valley, with low clouds clinging to the hillsides like morning veils. James Morrison had spent a restless night in the small guest room at the Williams house, his dress uniform hanging carefully on the wardrobe door, pressed to perfection for the most important ceremony he would ever perform. He had awakened before dawn, unable to sleep, and had stood at the window watching the valley slowly emerge from the darkness, thinking about friendship, duty, and the terrible price of serving something greater than oneself. Downstairs, the house was already stirring with quiet activity. Mrs. Williams moved through the kitchen with the mechanical precision of someone functioning on duty rather than emotion, preparing breakfast for a household that had little appetite for food. Di Williams sat at the kitchen table in his best suit, reading and rereading the order of service while his hands shook almost imperceptibly. Sarah had arrived from her hotel in Cardiff, where she had spent the night with her boyfriend Mark, needing some space from the overwhelming grief that filled her childhood home. The past 3 days had been a blur of activity and visitors. The story of James's escort duty had spread throughout Wales and beyond, picked up by national media and shared thousands of times on social media. The Williams family had found themselves at the center of a story that seemed to resonate with people across the country, a reminder of military sacrifice and the bonds that transcended death itself. Flowers had arrived from strangers across Britain, military units from around the Commonwealth, and even from American soldiers who had served alongside British forces in Afghanistan and Syria. The local florist had run out of storage space and had to rent a refrigerated truck to handle the overflow. Letters and cards filled several boxes, each one offering condolences and expressing gratitude for Tommy's service. But for all the national attention, this morning was about something more intimate and personal. This was about a family saying goodbye to their son and brother, a community honoring one of their own, and friends ensuring that a good man received the recognition he had earned through his life and death. James dressed with meticulous care, each element of his ceremonial uniform checked and rechecked. The red tunic that had caused such controversy at the airport now felt like armor, a visible symbol of the military family that had claimed Tommy and, though it ensured his memory, lived on long after today's ceremonies. The sword at his side had been polished to mirror brightness, and his boots reflected the pale morning light streaming through the bedroom window. At exactly 8 o'clock, the funeral director arrived to transport the family to St. David's Church. The hearse carrying Tommy's coffin had been positioned outside the house since dawn, allowing neighbors and early visitors to pay their respects before the formal service began. James helped Mrs. Williams into the lead car, noting how she had aged years in the past week, grief etching new lines around her eyes and turning her hair grayer than her 58 years should have allowed. The journey through the valley to the church took them past Tommy's entire childhood world. They drove by his primary school, where a group of current pupils had gathered with their teacher to wave small Union Jacks as the procession passed. They passed the rugby club where Tommy had learned teamwork and determination, where a banner now hung proclaiming him our hero in both English and Welsh. They drove through the town center, where shopkeepers had closed their businesses for the morning and stood on the pavements in respectful silence. St. David's Church stood at the heart of the community, its stone walls blackened by more than a century of industrial pollution, but its spirit undimmed by economic hardship or social change. The building was already full when the procession arrived, with additional mourners standing in the churchyard and spilling out into the surrounding streets. James was amazed by the turnout. He had expected a respectable crowd of family and friends, but this looked more like a state funeral than a service for a private soldier from a small Welsh town. The honor guard from the Royal Welsh Fusiliers was waiting at the church entrance, 8 soldiers in dress uniform who would carry Tommy's coffin into the sacred space where he would receive his final blessing. Major Jenkins stood at their head, his bearing impeccable despite the emotion James could see in his eyes. These men had known Tommy personally, had served with him, had shared the dangers and brotherhood of military life. As the family emerged from their car, the crowd fell silent. Mrs. Williams walked with dignified grace despite her obvious grief, supported by Di on one side and James on the other. Sarah followed with Mark, her face pale, but determined to honor her brother's memory with strength rather than collapse. Behind them came Tommy's extended family. Aunts and uncles, cousins, and grandparents, the entire clan gathered to say farewell to one of their brightest lights. The church service was a perfect blend of military tradition and community warmth. Father McKenna spoke with genuine affection about the boy he had known and watched grow into a man of courage and integrity. He read from Tommy's service record, detailing his decorations and achievements, but he also shared personal stories of a young man who helped elderly neighbors with their shopping, who coached youth rugby in his spare time, who never forgot where he came from or the people who had shaped him. The congregation sang, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah," with voices that seemed to shake the ancient stones of the church. The Welsh male voice choir from the local working men's club provided harmony that was both beautiful and heartbreaking, their voices carrying grief and pride in equal measure. When they sang the final verse in Welsh, even those who couldn't understand the words felt the power of a community mourning one of its own. James delivered the eulogy, speaking not as a soldier to civilians, but as a friend to friends about the man they had all loved. He told stories of Tommy's humor and courage, his loyalty and generosity, his pride in his Welsh heritage, and his commitment to serving something greater than himself. He spoke about the night in Afghanistan when Tommy had saved his life, and about how that act of courage was just one example of who Tommy had always been, someone who put others first, even when it cost him everything. Tommy Williams was the best of us, James concluded, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He carried the values of this community into the wider world, and he died protecting people he barely knew because that's who he was. He was our friend, our brother, our son. He was a soldier, but more than that, he was a man who understood that true strength comes from lifting others up, not putting them down. The service concluded with the traditional military honors. The honor guard lifted Tommy's coffin with parade ground precision, their movements synchronized through countless hours of practice. As they carried him from the church, the congregation stood in respectful silence, many wiping away tears that could no longer be contained. Outside, the scene was extraordinary. Hundreds of people lined the route to the cemetery, many holding small Welsh flags or poppies. Veterans from multiple conflicts stood at attention as the procession passed, their own memories of lost comrades bringing fresh relevance to Tommy's sacrifice. Children who had been excused from school for the morning threw flower petals in the path of the hearse, their innocent gestures adding beauty to the solemnity of the occasion. The cemetery occupied a hillside overlooking the valley, its weathered headstones telling the story of generations who had lived and died in this close-knit community. Tommy's gravesite had been prepared near a section reserved for miners who had died in industrial accidents, men who had also given their lives in service to something larger than themselves. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. Tommy was taking his place among the heroes of his community, different in the details of their sacrifice, but united in their willingness to put others first. The graveside service was brief, but profound. Father McKenna offered final prayers while the honor guard prepared for the traditional three-volley salute. The crack of rifles echoed across the valley, a sharp sound that seemed to punctuate the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. As the echoes faded, a lone bugler played the last post one final time, the haunting melody carrying Tommy's spirit into the Welsh hills that would forever be his home. James stepped forward as the final notes died away and carefully folded the Union Jack that had draped Tommy's coffin throughout his journey home. The flag, crisp and precise in its triangular form, was then presented to Mrs. Williams with the traditional words, "On behalf of a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a token of our appreciation for your son's honorable and faithful service." Mrs. Williams clutched the flag to her chest, the physical symbol of Tommy's sacrifice now transformed into a tangible connection to the son she would never see again. Around the gravesite, family and friends began placing flowers on the freshly turned earth. Red roses, white lilies, Welsh daffodils, and single poppies that would mark this place as the resting spot of someone who had died for others. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, James found himself standing alone beside the grave for a few minutes of private farewell. The noise of departing cars and conversations faded into the background, leaving him with his thoughts and memories of 15 years of friendship that had been cut far too short. "Well, mate," he said quietly, "you're home now. Your mom's proud. Your dad's proud. Sarah's proud. The whole valley's proud. You did good, Tommy Williams. You did really good." A gentle Welsh breeze stirred the flowers on the grave, carrying with it the scents of the hills and valleys that had shaped Tommy's character. In the distance, James could hear the sound of children playing in the streets below, the ordinary life of the community continuing as it always had and always would. Tommy was part of that continuity now, his memory woven into the fabric of a place that would never forget him. Mrs. Williams appeared beside James, having returned from seeing off the other mourners. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, for bringing him home, for staying with him, for keeping your promise." "He was my brother," James replied. "Nothing could have kept me from bringing him home." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people united by their love for someone whose physical presence was gone, but whose influence would last forever. Around them, the Welsh landscape stretched away toward distant horizons, beautiful and enduring and peaceful, the kind of place worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth remembering. As they walked back down the hillside toward the waiting cars and the reception that would follow, James knew that his duty was complete, but that his connection to the Williams family would last forever. Tommy was home, safe and honored and loved, resting among his own people in the land that had made him who he was. The journey that had begun with a promise to a grieving mother had ended with the fulfillment of that promise, and with the knowledge that some bonds truly are stronger than death itself. The afternoon reception at the community center was filled with stories and laughter, tears, and remembrance. People shared memories of Tommy that painted a picture of a life well lived despite its brevity. The mood gradually shifted from grief toward celebration, from mourning toward gratitude for having known someone so special. By evening, James knew that while Tommy Williams was gone, his legacy would live on in the hearts and memories of everyone whose life he had touched. The Royal Guard had completed his final mission, and Tommy Williams was finally, truly, completely home.